In a moment that shook the Family Feud stage, Steve Harvey confronted a contestant who publicly mocked a black woman, and his unexpected response left everyone speechless. What began as typical game show banter suddenly transformed into a powerful stand against disrespect that nobody saw coming. The television host, known for his comedic timing, was about to show the world a different side, one that would earn him respect far beyond entertainment. And the way he handled it? Nobody was prepared for what happened next. Family Feud, bright lights, enthusiastic contestants, and the unmistakable presence of Steve Harvey commanding the stage with his signature charm. The audience was electric that day, laughing at Steve's jokes and cheering for the competing families as they always did. The familiar theme music had just faded, and the studio buzzed with that special kind of excitement that only comes when cameras are rolling and dreams of winning big money hang in the balance. Two families stood facing each other, palms hovering over buzzers, ready to battle it out for cash and prizes. The Johnson family on the left, a tight-knit group from Atlanta with matching t-shirts and practiced high fives. On the right, the Williamson family from Chicago, equally determined and already strategizing in whispered conversations. Among them stood Mark Williamson, a contestant with an easy smile and confident demeanor. The type who seemed comfortable in front of cameras and quick with responses. Something about his posture suggested he wasn't just here to play. He was here to win, and perhaps to make an impression. The game progressed normally at first. Steve moved between contestants with practiced ease, his gold-trimmed cards in hand, delivering questions with perfect timing and punctuating responses with his trademark facial expressions that had made him a household name. The studio hummed with that familiar game show energy. The collective anticipation of right answers, the groans at missed opportunities, the eruption of applause with each successful response. Camera operators tracked the action while producers nodded approvingly from the sidelines. In the third row of the audience sat Tanya, a young black woman who had been selected to participate in an audience response segment later in the show. The cameras occasionally panned to her enthusiastic reactions. She was exactly the kind of audience member producers loved, genuinely invested in the game and radiating positive energy. Little did she know she would soon become central to an unexpected confrontation that would ripple far beyond the confines of this studio. What nobody realized was that this ordinary episode was about to veer dramatically off script. The light-hearted competition that had been unfolding according to plan was seconds away from transforming into something much more significant. As Steve turned toward Mark to get his answer for, "Name something that might make a woman feel special," nobody could have predicted the chain of events that was about to unfold or how quickly the atmosphere would change. But what started as just another day on set would soon become a moment that would define Steve Harvey's legacy forever. The tension was building as Steve Harvey turned to Mark Williamson, microphone extended. The studio lights seemed to intensify, casting a spotlight on this moment of anticipated gameplay. "Name something that might make a woman feel special," Steve repeated, his voice carrying through the studio speakers with that familiar cadence that had guided countless contestants through moments just like this one. Mark leaned forward with a smirk, adjusting his Family Feud name tag and clearing his throat. The confidence in his posture suggested he thought he had something clever to offer. "Well, Steve," he began, his voice carrying a hint of mischief, "I'd say a compliment on her appearance." He paused dramatically, eyes scanning the crowd before settling on his target. "Unless she looks like her." He pointed directly at Tanya in the audience, the black woman who had been enthusiastically participating all evening, her joy evident in every reaction shot the cameras had captured. The studio's atmosphere transformed instantly. A few awkward laughs quickly died away as the gravity of what had just happened settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The bright studio suddenly felt colder. Tanya's smile froze, then faltered, her expression shifting from excitement to humiliation in real time as cameras inadvertently captured her reaction. The light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a wounded confusion that asked the unspoken question, "Why me?" Her friends beside her stiffened, one placing a protective hand on her shoulder, another whispering something in her ear that the microphones couldn't pick up. The other contestants looked visibly uncomfortable. Mark's own family members shifted away slightly, creating a subtle but noticeable distance between themselves and him. His sister winced and looked at the floor, while his brother's enthusiastic posture deflated. The Johnson family exchanged glances of disbelief, their competitive spirit replaced by collective discomfort. Mrs. Johnson, the matriarch, pursed her lips in disapproval, shaking her head slightly. The audience, normally quick with reactions, sat in stunned silence. The usual background murmur disappeared, replaced by a heavy stillness that seemed to press down on everyone present. A child's voice broke through momentarily. "Mommy, what did that man say?" Followed by a hushed parental response. Production assistants exchanged alarmed glances, and a director could be seen frantically speaking into his headset, likely discussing how to handle this unexpected situation. Camera operators, professionals trained to remain neutral, struggled to maintain their composure, one visibly grimacing behind his equipment. Tanya, to her credit, maintained her composure despite the public humiliation. She straightened her back and lifted her chin, refusing to be diminished by the cruel comment, though the hurt in her eyes was unmistakable. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears that threatened to fall, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from trembling. The cameras caught this quiet dignity, this refusal to break down despite the unprovoked attack on her appearance. A woman sitting nearby reached across to squeeze her hand in solidarity. Mark seemed oblivious to the damage he had caused, still wearing that self-satisfied smirk, apparently pleased with what he thought was clever humor. He glanced around, searching for validation, finding none. The laughter he had expected never materialized, and in its absence, the weight of his words hung in the air. His confidence began to waver slightly as he registered the room's reaction, but rather than backtracking, he doubled down with a nervous chuckle and a shrug that seemed to say, "Can't you take a joke?" The production assistant holding the scoreboard froze in place. The camera director hesitated on which angle to cut to. The normally seamless production suddenly felt disjointed and uncertain. In the control room, producers were likely debating whether to cut the segment entirely. But the moment was unfolding too quickly for intervention. The studio fell silent as all eyes turned to Steve Harvey, whose expression had transformed from his usual animated hosting demeanor to something entirely different. His jovial smile disappeared, replaced by a look that few had seen on the typically light-hearted show. His eyes narrowed slightly, his jaw set firm, and his entire body seemed to shift into a stance that commanded attention in a new way. The microphone in his hand, usually an instrument of fun and games, now seemed poised to deliver something far more significant than the next survey question. No one could have predicted what was about to happen next, as Steve Harvey was about to do something nobody saw coming. Steve Harvey stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, but was merely seconds. The microphone in his hand seemed heavier now, no longer just a tool of his trade, but a symbol of the responsibility he carried. The studio lights, normally flattering and warm, cast shadows across his face that emphasized the severity of his expression. Deep lines formed around his eyes, not from laughter as they usually did, but from an intensity rarely seen on the light-hearted game show. The production team, sensing something momentous was about to happen, did not cut to commercial as they might have under normal circumstances. Instead, they zoomed in on Steve's face, capturing every nuance of what was to come. In the control room, a producer whispered, "Stay with him," recognizing the authenticity of the moment unfolding. "Hold on now," Steve finally said, his voice low and controlled, carrying that distinctive timbre that had made him instantly recognizable to millions. He raised his hand, stopping the game in its tracks. The signature Family Feud music faded to silence, leaving only the sound of the studio's ventilation system and the occasional cough from the audience. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. He turned to face Mark directly, no longer the affable host, but a man standing firmly in his convictions. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the entertainer who had built a career on making people laugh, replaced by someone who understood that some moments called for seriousness rather than smiles. "What did you just say?" The question hung in the air, not seeking clarification, but offering Mark one chance to recognize his error. Steve's eyes never left Mark's face, holding him accountable with just his gaze. Mark's smirk faltered slightly, the confidence draining from his posture as he began to realize the gravity of the situation. He shifted his weight from one foot to another, glancing briefly at his family members who offered no support. "Just a joke, Steve. Lighten up," he said with a nervous chuckle that fell flat in the silent studio. He attempted to wave it off casually, but his hand motion seemed stiff and uncertain. Steve nodded slowly, processing this response. His mustache twitched slightly, a telltale sign to regular viewers that he was controlling his emotions. He placed the question cards deliberately on his podium, the sound of cards meeting wood audible in the silent studio. Then he took 2 steps toward Mark, closing the distance between them. The movement was purposeful, almost ceremonial in its deliberateness. "Let me tell you something," Steve began, his voice resonating through the silent studio, carrying decades of lived experience in each syllable. "I've been in entertainment for decades. I've told jokes on stages across this country. I've heard all kinds of jokes. But what you just did..." He paused, letting the question sink in. "That wasn't a joke. That was cruelty disguised as humor. And there's a difference." He gestured toward Tanya in the audience, his movement drawing all eyes to her. "That beautiful young woman came here today to enjoy herself, to be part of something fun. She took time off work, got dressed up, came to the studio to be part of our Family Feud family." His voice softened momentarily. "She didn't sign up to be your punchline. Nobody deserves that. Nobody walks into a room expecting to be diminished." The cameras captured Tanya's expression, surprise giving way to gratitude as tears welled in her eyes. A small smile formed on her lips, not of happiness, but of vindication, of being seen and defended. The friend beside her squeezed her hand tightly, their fingers interlocked in solidarity. Several audience members around her nodded in agreement with Steve's words, a few wiping away their own tears. "Now, I've made mistakes in my life," Steve continued, his voice gaining momentum like a preacher building to the heart of his sermon. "Lord knows I've said things I regret. I've had to apologize, had to grow, had to learn. But I've learned that a real man, a decent human being, recognizes when they've hurt someone and makes it right." He tapped his chest with his fist for emphasis, the microphone picking up the soft thud. "That's not weakness. That's character." Steve turned to address the audience, and the millions watching at home, his gaze sweeping across the studio before settling on the main camera. His posture straightened, shoulders back, head held high. See? What we're not going to do is normalize disrespect and call it entertainment. What we're not going to do is make anyone feel less than because of how they look, who they love, or where they come from. And what I'm definitely not going to do, his voice dropped an octave, is stand here and let it happen on my watch. The studio remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted from discomfort to something more profound, a collective recognition of a line being drawn. Some audience members nodded in agreement, others sat perfectly still, absorbing the weight of his words. A production assistant wiped away a tear. Even the normally stoic cameramen seemed moved, their equipment steady, but their expressions changed. You know, Steve continued, loosening his tie slightly as if preparing for a deeper conversation. I grew up in Cleveland. I wasn't born with a silver spoon. I've been homeless, lived in my car, showered at gas stations while trying to make it in this business. I've been judged, overlooked, and underestimated. So I know something about how it feels when someone decides your worth based on what they see, not who you are. He paused, letting his personal revelation settle. And I promised myself that if I ever got in a position of influence, I'd use it right. Steve turned back to Mark, whose confident demeanor had completely dissolved. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his eyes darted around, looking for an escape that wasn't there. You have a choice right now, Steve told him, his voice firm but not unkind. You have a choice that we all face when we mess up. You can double down on disrespect, or you can show everyone watching what accountability looks like. The cameras panned across the faces in the studio, contestants, audience members, even crew, all witnessing a moment that had transcended the game show format and become something far more significant. Parents pulled their children closer. Elderly audience members nodded in solemn agreement. The Johnson family stood a little straighter, respect evident in their posture. The easy thing, Steve continued, would be for me to move on. Keep the show light, keep the laughs coming, pretend this didn't happen. That's what some might expect. But sometimes the right thing and the easy thing ain't the same thing. He gestured toward the Family Feud logo on the wall. This show is about family. And in a family, we hold each other accountable. We help each other be better. The studio lights seemed to intensify, focusing on this pivotal moment between two men, one who had crossed a line and another who refused to let it stand. The usual game show glitz faded into the background as something more authentic took center stage. The red and blue Family Feud set, normally so vibrant and playful, now served as a backdrop for a lesson in human dignity. What happened next would not only determine the fate of this particular episode, but would become a defining moment in Steve Harvey's career, and a lesson that would resonate far beyond the walls of this studio. Mark Williamson stood frozen under the studio lights, the weight of Steve Harvey's words pressing down on him like a physical force. The cameras captured his transformation, from cocky contestant to a man confronted with the consequences of his actions. His family members remained distant, creating a visible gap that spoke volumes about their own discomfort with his behavior. For several seconds, the studio remained suspended in silence. The production team, recognizing the significance of what was unfolding, kept the cameras rolling. This had transcended entertainment. It had become a moment of cultural importance that couldn't be edited away or softened with background music. Mark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. He began, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. I didn't think That's right, Steve interjected, not unkindly but firmly. You didn't think. And that's the problem with so many of the hurtful things we say and do. We don't think about the impact. Mark nodded slowly, the reality of the situation finally settling on his shoulders. His eyes, previously darting around the room seeking escape, finally settled on Tanya in the audience. Something shifted in his expression, the beginning of genuine recognition. "I'm sorry," he said, addressing Tanya directly. "What I said was completely out of line. It wasn't funny, and you didn't deserve that. Nobody deserves that." His voice grew steadier as he continued. "I got caught up in trying to be the funny guy, and I didn't consider how my words would hurt you. There's no excuse for it." The cameras captured Tanya's face as she listened to his apology. She maintained her dignity, giving a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness. That would be hers to give or withhold as she chose. But it was recognition of his attempt at accountability. Steve watched this exchange carefully, then turned back to Mark. "That's a start," he said. "But an apology is just words, unless it changes how you act moving forward." Mark nodded, the humility in his posture now genuine. "You're right. I need to do better." Steve turned to address the wider audience. "See, this right here is important. We all mess up. We all say things we shouldn't. The question isn't whether we'll make mistakes. We will. The question is what we do afterward." Gestured around the studio. "What just happened here might seem small in the grand scheme of things. It's just one comment on one game show. But these moments, they add up. They shape our culture. They tell us what's acceptable and what isn't." The studio audience, previously stunned into silence, now began to nod in agreement. A few people applauded softly, the sound growing as others joined in. Not the usual game show excitement, but a deeper appreciation for the unexpected turn toward authenticity. Steve turned to the Johnson family, who had been waiting patiently during this unplanned interlude. "Now, I want to thank y'all for your patience. This wasn't what any of us expected today, but sometimes the most important moments are the ones we don't plan for." Mrs. Johnson, the family matriarch, stepped forward slightly. "Steve, can I say something?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. Steve nodded, extending his microphone to her. "I just want to say," she began, looking directly at the camera, "that this is why we've always respected you, Mr. Harvey. You could have let that slide. You could have kept the show moving. But you chose to stand for something more important than entertainment." She turned toward Tanya in the audience. "And to that young lady, you handled yourself with such grace, such dignity." The studio erupted in applause, this time full-throated and genuine. Tanya wiped away a tear, smiling through her emotion as the audience's support washed over her. As the applause began to fade, Steve reclaimed control of the moment. "All right now, we've still got a game to play. But I think we've all learned something more valuable than points on a board today." He turned to the producers off camera. "But before we continue, I'd like to invite Tanya to come down here." The audience murmured in surprise as a production assistant escorted Tanya from her seat down to the main stage. Steve welcomed her with a respectful handshake. "Tanya, I want to apologize to you that this happened in our house," Steve said. "And I want to thank you for showing us all what real class looks like." Tanya, now standing in the spotlight she never sought, took a deep breath. The microphone was offered to her, giving her the choice to speak or decline. The studio waited, recognizing that whatever came next would be entirely on her terms. Tanya stood in the spotlight, a place she had never sought nor expected to find herself. The microphone felt heavy in her hand. The eyes of the studio audience and millions of viewers at home all focused on her. For a moment, she hesitated, the weight of expectation pressing upon her shoulders. The studio remained silent, giving her the space and time she needed. She looked up, her eyes meeting Steve's, finding encouragement in his steady gaze. Then she straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and brought the microphone closer. "Thank you, Steve," she began, her voice soft at first, but gaining strength with each word. "I came here today just hoping to be on camera for a second, maybe laugh a little, have a good time with my friends." She gestured toward her group in the audience, who nodded encouragingly. "I never expected to become part of whatever this is." She paused, collecting her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet authority that commanded attention. "What happened today happens to people like me every day. Maybe not on national television, but in offices, in schools, in stores, places where we're just trying to exist like everyone else." Her words resonated through the silent studio. The difference is, most times, there isn't a Steve Harvey to step in. Most times people laugh along or look away or pretend they didn't hear. She turned slightly to face Mark, who had the decency to maintain eye contact despite his obvious discomfort. "I accept your apology," she told him, her tone neither angry nor particularly warm, just honest. "And I hope this moment stays with you, not as something to feel ashamed about forever, but as a reminder that words have power. They can wound deeper than you know." She turned back to address the wider audience. "But this isn't just about one comment or one person. It's about all of us and the world we create together, moment by moment, choice by choice." The studio remained transfixed. Production assistants, normally bustling about with clipboards and headsets, stood still. Camera operators, trained to remain detached, found themselves moved by the unscripted authenticity unfolding before their lenses. "I'm a third-grade teacher," Tanya continued, offering this personal detail with a small smile. "Every day, I try to teach my students that they matter, that they're valuable, that how they treat each other shapes who they become. And then they go home and watch TV, and they see what we adults think is acceptable." She gestured around the studio. "So what happened here today? This conversation? It matters. It matters that Steve spoke up. It matters that Mark apologized. It matters that we're talking about this instead of just moving on." Steve nodded, a look of profound respect on his face. The cameras caught this silent exchange. Two people who had never met before, connected now by an unexpected moment of truth. "I didn't come here looking to give a speech," Tanya said with a small laugh, some of her natural warmth returning. "But since I have this microphone, I just want to say, be kind. Stand up when you see someone being treated unfairly. And remember that the person you're talking to, or about, has a whole life you know nothing about. They have people who love them, dreams you can't see, struggles you can't imagine." The studio burst into spontaneous applause, people rising to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to surprise even Tanya herself. She blinked rapidly, visibly moved by the response. In the audience, her friends wiped away tears, beaming with pride. As the applause began to subside, Steve reclaimed his microphone, placing a gentle hand on Tanya's shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been doing this show for years, and I've never been prouder of what happens on this stage than I am right now." His voice carried genuine emotion. "Tanya, thank you for your grace and your wisdom. I think you just taught all of us something important." He turned to the producers off camera. "In fact, I think we need to do something special here." He gestured to Mark and his family, then to the Johnson family. "Both of these families came here to play for 20,000. But I'm thinking, whatever happens in Orgametidae, we should make it 20,000. But I'm thinking, whatever happens in our game today, we should make it 20,000. But I'm thinking, whatever happens in Orgametidae, we should make a 20,000 donation in Tanya's name to an organization that fights bullying and promotes respect in schools. What do you say?" The studio erupted in cheers again. The Johnson family nodded enthusiastically, and even Mark's family seemed relieved at this positive turn. Mark himself stepped forward. "I'd like to match that donation personally," he said, his voice steady now. "It's the least I can do." Steve raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "Now that's what I call growth," he said, extending his hand to Mark, who shook it firmly. As Tanya prepared to return to her seat, now escorted by thunderous applause, Steve addressed the cameras directly. "Folks at home, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll get back to our game. But I want you to know that what you just witnessed wasn't planned. It wasn't in any script. It was just human beings trying to be better, trying to do right by each other. And maybe that's the most important game we can play." As the show cut to commercial, the energy in the studio had transformed completely. What had begun as an ordinary episode of Family Feud had become something none of them would ever forget. A moment when entertainment gave way to truth. When a game show became a platform for something far more meaningful. And as the cameras temporarily stopped rolling, something remarkable happened. Contestants from both families approached Tanya not with the awkwardness one might expect, but with genuine connection. Production crew members wiped away tears. The studio audience remained standing, their applause continuing even after the on-air lights dimmed. In a culture often criticized for its superficiality, for its willingness to sacrifice dignity for ratings, something authentic had broken through. And everyone present knew they were witnessing not just good television, but a genuine human moment that would resonate long after the points were tallied and the prizes awarded. When the director called for everyone to return to their positions for the resumption of filming, something had changed in the studio. The game would continue, but it would do so in an atmosphere transformed by courage, by accountability, and by the unexpected eloquence of a third-grade teacher who had come to the studio simply hoping to be seen on camera for a second. 3 weeks later, Steve Harvey sat in his private office at the studio, reviewing emails on his laptop. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the space filled with mementos from his long career. Photographs with celebrities, awards, and personal keepsakes that told the story of his journey from stand-up comedian to television icon. His assistant knocked gently on the door before entering. "Steve, I think you'll want to see this," she said, placing a tablet on his desk. "It's trending everywhere." Steve picked up the tablet and immediately recognized the scene. It was the moment from that remarkable Family Feud episode, now being shared across social media platforms, news sites, and discussion forums. The clip had gone viral in a way that even veteran producers couldn't have predicted. 20 million views since yesterday, his assistant said, pointing to the numbers. And that's just on one platform. Steve leaned back in his chair, taking it all in. The network had debated whether to air the episode at all. Reality television thrived on conflict and entertainment, not on moral reckonings. But ultimately, they had decided to broadcast it with minimal editing, preserving the raw authenticity of what had transpired. "There's more," his assistant continued, swiping to another screen. Tanya's been invited to speak at educational conferences. 3 major talk shows want her as a guest. And a children's book publisher has approached her about writing a book on respect and dignity for elementary school students. Steve smiled, genuinely pleased by this turn of events. Good for her. She deserves it. His phone buzzed with an incoming call. The network president. Steve answered, listening intently as the executive spoke. They want to do a special? Steve asked, raising his eyebrows. About what happened that day? He listened for another moment. A whole series on difficult conversations in America? And they want me to host? He chuckled softly. Well, that's certainly not what I expected when I went to work that morning. After ending the call, Steve stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Los Angeles skyline. 25 years in entertainment had taught him that most moments were fleeting. Even the ones that seemed important at the time faded quickly from public consciousness. But occasionally, very occasionally, something broke through in a way that couldn't be manufactured or planned. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Your next appointment is here, his assistant announced. Steve turned to see Mark Williamson standing in the doorway, looking considerably more humble than he had on the game show stage. They had spoken briefly after the taping, but this meeting had been scheduled at Mark's request. Mark, come in, Steve said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Thanks for making the trip. Mark sat down, clearly nervous but determined. I appreciate you seeing me, Steve. I know you're busy. Never too busy to finish an important conversation, Steve replied, studying the man before him. How have things been since the show aired? Mark took a deep breath. Challenging, he admitted. Some people in my community weren't happy with how I represented them. My kids had to deal with some fallout at school. He paused. But necessary. It forced me to look at patterns I hadn't recognized in myself. Steve nodded, appreciating the honesty. That's growth. Uncomfortable, but valuable. The thing is, Mark continued, leaning forward slightly, I've been thinking about what Tanya said, about how moments like that happen every day without someone stepping in. And I realized I've been on both sides of that equation more times than I care to admit. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. I run a construction company. We employ about 50 people. After what happened, I went back and really looked at our culture, our policies, the way we talk to each other. He handed the document to Steve. This is a new training program we're implementing. It's about respect in the workplace, about recognizing the impact of our words. I'd like your thoughts on it. Steve took the document, genuinely surprised. This is comprehensive, he said as he scanned the pages. You're serious about this? I am, Mark confirmed. I've also reached out to Tanya. She's agreed to review our educational materials and possibly help us refine them. He smiled slightly. Turns out third-grade teachers know a lot about explaining complicated concepts in accessible ways. Steve set the document down, studying Mark with new respect. You know, when people mess up publicly, they usually just want to move on, pretend it never happened. It takes character to turn it into something constructive. Mark nodded. I could have just laid low, waited for it to blow over. But then I'd have missed the opportunity to actually learn something. He paused. My teenage daughter told me something that really hit home. She said, Dad, you've always told us to own our mistakes. Now we're watching to see if you meant it. Steve laughed appreciatively. Kids have a way of cutting through the noise, don't they? They sure do, Mark agreed. Anyway, I came here because I wanted you to know that what happened that day, It didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling, at least not for me. Before Steve could respond, his assistant appeared at the door again. "Sorry to interrupt, but you'll want to see this." She handed him her phone, open to a news alert. The headline read, "Senate Committee Announces Hearings on Media Responsibility Following Viral Family Feud Moment." Steve shook his head in amazement. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured, showing the screen to Mark. "Looks like our little moment is having some big ripples." "Does that surprise you?" Mark asked. "You're Steve Harvey. People listen when you speak." Steve handed the phone back to his assistant. "It's not about me," he said thoughtfully. "It's about the moment. It's about Tanya. It's about you. It's about all of us recognizing that we have choices in how we treat each other." He paused. "And maybe it's about timing, too. Maybe this conversation was just waiting to happen, and we provided the spark." As Mark prepared to leave, Steve walked him to the door. "Keep me updated on that training program," he said. "I might know some people who could help implement it more widely." After Mark departed, Steve returned to the window, contemplating the unexpected journey that had begun with one unscripted moment on a game show set. In an industry often criticized for its superficiality, something authentic had broken through, something that resonated with people's hunger for accountability, for respect, for human dignity. His phone buzzed again. Another call, another interview request, another opportunity to expand the conversation. The ripples continued to spread, touching lives far beyond that studio audience, creating possibilities that none of them could have imagined when they arrived at the studio that day. Steve smiled to himself as he picked up the phone. Some days you showed up to host a game show, and some days you ended up being part of something much bigger. Today, it seemed, was one of those days.